Hey everyone, and welcome to today's YouTube video. My name is Vinay Bhaskara. I'm one of the co-founders of CollegeVine, and in today's YouTube video, I'm going to be talking to all of you about how to write the 2020-2021 University of California essays. Before I get into the video, I do want to mention that the vast majority of you who are watching our videos these days are not subscribed to this YouTube channel. So when you get a chance, please do hit the subscribe button down below. Be sure to hit the bell icon to get notified every time we post new videos. We've got a lot of great content that came out in the last few days, and we've got a lot more great content coming to all of you throughout the month of December and beyond. Make sure to like the video, obviously. Share it with a friend. If you don't like the video, share it with an enemy. Just make sure you share the video regardless. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and get into today's video. All right, in today's video, we're going to be talking about how to write the 2020-2021 University of California essays. Maybe as a good starting point, let's talk about the UC applications, the actual, sort of application that you'll be writing these essays for. So the UC application is a shared application for the 9 undergraduate University of California campuses. Now, most years, this application is due on November 30th, but because 2020 is literally the year where everything possible can go wrong, this year that deadline has been delayed to this Friday, December 4th at 11:59 p.m. PST, Pacific Standard Time, or I guess local time for most of you, depending on what time zone you're in, due to technical issues. The University of California couldn't get its application working for tonight's original deadline. I'm recording this on November 30th, so we thought we'd put up a video to help out any of you out there who are procrastinating on your college essay. Now, what are the schools in the University of California system? We're really talking about 9 different schools here, all of which share a common application, but not the common application, if that makes sense. So the 9 schools in question are UC Berkeley, UCLA, Los Angeles, for that matter, UC Irvine, UC San Diego, UC Riverside, UC Santa Barbara, UC Davis, where Hassan Minhaj went to school. It's near Sacramento, UC Santa Cruz, and UC Merced. So those are your 9 UC schools. There is actually a 10th UC school, UC San Francisco, but it's kind of the black sheep of the UC system because it only has graduate students. So far fewer in the form of mass protests, which of course the UC system is famous for, especially UC Berkeley. So let's get into today's video and talk about the UC essays. Before we get into breaking down the specific essay prompts, I'm going to start by talking a little bit at the high level about why the essays matter so much and sort of why getting these essays right is really, really important. Just first at a general level, right? Those college essays are going to be about 30% of your application, right? After your, the combined impact of your grades and your SAT scores in a normal year, we'll talk about why that's not true this year in a second, the essays are the single most important factor in your college application and admission at selective colleges. And a lot of the UC schools are very selective. They're very hard to get into, even these days, even some of the Cal State schools, which is sort of the next group of California public colleges, are really competitive to get into. So college essays are about 30% of the weight of your college application at these selective schools, and they're the single most important personal component of your application. They're really the biggest thing that helps you stand out from the crowd in the admissions process, right? That's how you reveal to admissions officers who you are, what you value and care about, how you respond to different situations, and your mental and emotional approach in those situations, right? And, the thing that's important to keep in mind with college essays is because it's revealing all these things about you, oftentimes that's going to be how you actually win over an admissions officer at these selective colleges. At all these selective colleges, when you look just at grades, test scores in some cases, and, resume and extracurricular accomplishments, usually there's going to still be 3, 4, 5. At places like Harvard, it might be 7 or 8 equivalently qualified applicants for every single spot in the class, right? So how do you get yourself selected? How do you get yourself picked out of the crowd of those 7 or 8 people that have pretty similar accomplishments to you. That's where the essay comes into play. And the reason it matters so much is that these admissions officers have a lot of personal discretion in the admissions process. The way this works is to get admitted, you're going to need to win over 1 at smaller colleges or up to 3 or 4 admissions officers at larger colleges who, actively read your application, feel like, wow, we really want to make a case for this student. And then they have to go make your case to a broader admissions committee, which is composed of them and their other admissions officers. And that admissions committee is going to make that final decision. So to get admitted, you have to actively win over multiple admissions officers who have to be choosing you over everyone else in the admissions process. And that's really, really tough. And the only way to really do that when you look very similar on paper to other applicants is to get them to feel like, A, they know who you are personally, B, to like who you are, or at least the person you are in your college essays, and C, to actively root for you. You need them to want you to win at the game of life, win in the admissions process, win in the rat race. You need them to be your advocates. They have to actively choose you, right? So essays are super, super important in a normal year in college admissions. But 2020 isn't just a normal year. One unique change at the University of California schools this year is that they are actually all going to be test blind in 2020 due to court orders in the state of California. Now, what test blind means is that no standardized test score, whether it's an SAT test, an AP test, a SAT subject test, an ACT, none of those standardized tests can be considered by the UC schools in the admissions process, right? It's not like Harvard or a lot of the Ivies where they've gone to test optional policies. The UC schools are test blind. And what that means is that those essays are going to be even more important during this admission cycle. Because if in a normal year there's 4 or 5 or 8 people who are equivalently qualified for the same spot, this year it might be 10 or 12 because there's some students who are qualified in everything else, but maybe don't quite have the test scores. This year, there's not going to be that difference. So what's going to end up happening is the essays are going to be even more of an important factor for separating out the students who are going to get accepted and the ones that are going to get rejected. And that's even before you take into account the fact that even the sort of pieces of your application that remain, stuff like your extracurricular activities, your grades, and your recommendation letters, those are all going to be less useful than in normal years, right? Your grades and your recommendation letters are going to be severely impacted, obviously, by the fact that your schools were all remote or mostly remote in the spring, and many of them have been on and off in the fall. Extracurricular opportunities have been delayed and disrupted and, frankly, mostly canceled around the country. And regardless of how great of a job you did serving your community during COVID-19, chances are that's just not going to be that big of a differentiator. So it's really going to come down to the essays. The stakes on your essays are more important than ever. So let's actually talk about the specific essays that you have to write for the University of California. And it is a bit of a rough application, right? The Common App asks you to write 1 650-word essays, whereas for the UC application, you have to submit 4 different supplemental essays, each of which has a 350-word limit, and you're picking 4 essays out of 8 possible prompts, right? Each with a 350-word limit. So let's actually walk through what those prompts are. Prompt number 1 is describe an example of your leadership experience in which you have positively influenced others, helped resolve disputes, or contributed to group efforts over time. Prompt number 2 is every person has a creative side, and it can be expressed in many ways: problem solving, original and innovative thinking, and artistically, to name a few. Describe how you express your creative side. Prompt number 3 is what would you say is your greatest talent or skill? How have you developed and demonstrated that talent over time? Prompt number 4 is describe how you've taken advantage of a significant educational opportunity or worked to overcome an educational barrier you have faced. Prompt number 5 is describe the most significant challenge you have faced and the steps you have taken to overcome this challenge. How has this challenge affected your academic environment? Prompt number 6 is think about an academic subject that inspires you. Describe how you have furthered this interest inside and or outside of the classroom. Prompt number 7 is what have you done to make your school or your community a better place? Prompt number 8 is beyond what has already been shared in your application, What do you believe makes you stand out as a strong candidate for admissions to the University of California? Now, before we dive into the individual prompts, I want to talk a little bit about how you choose which of the 4 essays you're going to be writing, right? And so it's really critical when you do this to balance between your different prompts, right? You want to use different prompts to show off different aspects of your personality, different skills, and talk about distinct, switch it up there, things that matter to you. And one of the nice things, one of the few saving graces of this really long and intense application is that because the UC application is not part of the Common App, you don't necessarily have to balance your supplemental or school-specific essays with your Common App essay. In fact, you can actually usually reuse an edited version of your Common App to respond to one of the prompts, which still will leave you with 3 that you have to write from scratch. Now, one particular note I have about your prompts is you can kind of choose whichever prompts you want. I don't have too much of an ideology about that kind of stuff, but I do tend to think it's beneficial to have at least one essay that's themed towards extracurricular activities or kind of an area of interest and skill, and one academically themed essay. And then the rest you can kind of choose whichever ones you have better topics for. So in general, my recommendation is that you should write at least one out of prompts 1, 2, 3, and 7, and then separately write at least one out of prompts 4, 5, and 6, right? The idea here is, again, you want your essays to work together almost like a portfolio. They should convey different elements of your application and support different elements of your application. And this year in particular, because your academic record from your grades and your transcripts isn't necessarily going to have that test score to help that out, and because your resume might have been impacted by COVID-related disruptions, right? It's beneficial to have one extracurricularly themed essay and one academically themed essay to kind of help support that and support that you'll be a good and productive member of the community at all these different UC schools. So let's dive into the specific prompts, right? So first up, we've got prompt number 1, which is the leadership prompt. And, I'm going to talk about a few things with each of these prompts, whether it's going to be mistakes that I commonly see folks make when writing essays in response, or it's things you should kind of keep in mind, or unique approaches to the essay. So starting with prompt number 1, the big thing here is you don't want to make this about positions. It's not really about I was the vice president of this club, or I was the highest state level leader in this organization. Right? It's about the actions of leadership, or a concept we here at CollegeVine call leadership by action. That is doing the things that a leader does. And what does a leader do, right? A leader could inspire group action, right? Inspire people either in your community, in a club, or wherever, to go and do something, right? Inspire folks, obviously, to maybe change their beliefs or change their point of view. Provide mentorship to younger folks or even just peers, serve as a positive influence on others, and execute on tangible projects, right? There are some other examples, right, such as planning for the future, thinking ahead, setting up infrastructure. All of these are the kinds of things that a leader does. And so your essay should be about those things, not about, I won this election because I'm so cool and popular, yay me. It's about the things that you did as a leader. It's about, showing that you've done these things and talking about why and how and digging in and reflecting, okay? And the great thing is that because it's about leadership by action, you don't have to have that formal leadership position to be able to respond to this essay. In fact, I would go even further and say that the best examples of this essay oftentimes come from not necessarily your most impressive leadership position, but from maybe an under-the-radar situation where you showed leadership, or even a situation where you showed leadership outside of a formal structure within a club or organization, right? And it's really important here, like I said, to avoid restating your resume. That's a general rule for college essays. It's also a general rule for life. If I went around saying, my name is Vinay Bhaskara and I got a 2400 on my SAT and I was an aviation journalist in high school, people wouldn't like me very much. People probably wouldn't like you very much if you restated your essay verbally. The same thing applies to your college essays. You don't want to just sit there and restate your resume. People can read that and understand your resume just based on reading it. You don't need to put it into an essay. The essay should be about who you are as a person. Prompt number 2 is the creativity prompt. And the big thing that I see with people who get stuck on this prompt is they get too hung up on the word creative, and they kind of pattern match that to artistic, right? A lot of people think, oh, creative, that means it's got to be about music or art or TikTok dances or whatever. But it's not just your renegade that you can talk about in this college essay. And it's really great that the renegade is already a dated reference because that's how fast things move these days. I don't want to sound like a grandparent or anything, but it is pretty crazy how quickly things move on TikTok. Anyway, that's off topic. Something you also want to avoid in your college essays. But this essay is not just about creative or artistic pursuits. It's about taking a unique approach to something or thinking about something in a unique way. Doing something that is different than the convention, that is different than the way things are typically done, that's what creativity is. And so obviously when you're creating a sculpture, you're creating it from scratch, and that's different than not having a sculpture or different than the stone that existed before you made the sculpture. But there's also ways you can show your creativity in problem solving, in thinking about the world, in understanding the world around you, in engaging with your community, with your friends, with your peers. And so I think that the best responses to this essay are often about something that's entirely unrelated to the arts, right? Which is not to say that you can't write a great version of this essay about your painting or your drawing or whatever, but I think some of the really cool essays I've seen in response to these kinds of prompts are about things like finding a creative way to make peace between two of your friends or between yourself and a friend of yours. Finding an interesting way to connect with your community. Right? I'm, for example, Indian American, and talking about the ways in which I managed to sort of, connect with other Indian Americans in my community, if it was creative, would be a great response to this prompt, right? One thing you want to do when you're responding to this prompt is to make sure it's clear why the thing that you did was creative, right? That's another mistake that I often see. You'll say, oh, I did this to solve this thing, or I approached this problem in this way, but you don't give me the explanation for why that's creative, right? You say, oh, I found this solution to a problem that my best friend was having. But you have to give me an explanation for why that's actually creative, right? You have to, and the way you do that is by actually drawing that contrast. Talk about what the conventional or common way of doing something is, and then talk about your creative approach. Now, this doesn't mean that 60% of your essay has to be about explaining the conventional situation. I'm talking about 1 or 2 sentences. But in a 350-word essay, those 1 or 2 sentences are still really, really important. Now, another thing you can do with this essay is really take the reader into your mental approach. You want the reader to understand how you think about problems, how you actually go about getting from point A to point B. And you want to be careful not to be afraid to talk about what didn't work, right? It's okay to have a couple of failures or setbacks along the way. That can just enhance the payoff to your creativity. In fact, if you want to talk about how you had a creative idea, it didn't quite work, and then you tweaked and adjusted it to then have a solution to the problem you were working on, that's going to maybe make the essay even more powerful, because the expected outcome is, oh, I had a problem, I came up with a creative solution, and it was solved. If you then take it a step further, it's, I had a problem, I came up with a creative solution, didn't quite work for these reasons, and then I made these adjustments, and then it was solved, right? Not only is that going to show off your creativity and your problem solving, it's also going to show off your perseverance, your resilience, and your ability to problem solve, and kind of roll with the punches, all of which are skills that colleges really value. Now, the next prompt here is your greatest talent or skill. And notice in the question that it asks specifically about how you demonstrated and developed that talent over time. So once again, we'll return to my favorite statement, which is don't restate your resume, right? This is not your place to say you are the best journalist. This is not your place to say, I'm the best journalist that ever lived on planet Earth. I I don't even know who you would recognize as journalists anymore because none of you watch TV. But I'm, Bob Woodward and Bernstein rolled into one. Congratulations to the two of you that got that reference. You don't want to just sit there and say you're great at something. This is not this is not the point of this prompt. It's not to, highlight your accomplishments, so to speak. It's much more so about almost the journey and the why, right? What is your greatest talent? But I would say the more important question, and really the way they should phrase the prompt if they said what they meant, is, and why is it your greatest talent or skill? Why does it matter to you? What are the things you did to develop it, and sort of how did you go about doing that, right? Now, one thing that's an interesting approach to this essay is to actually use intangible skills, such as being a peacemaker in situations where people are getting tense and fighting, or being a really empathetic listener who's able to help calm down your friends or your loved ones when they're in a really negative emotional state. Those kinds of intangible skills are just as valuable here. And if you maybe don't necessarily have the strongest resume in terms of formal accomplishments, talking about your intangible skills can also be a really valuable response to this essay that is a little bit unconventional and maybe stands out a little bit. That being said, this is still a great essay to talk about an area or something that you've done across multiple activities and years. If I were responding to this prompt, back when I applied to the UC schools, they had a different set of prompts. But if I were responding to this prompt today, I probably would have talked about, aviation or maybe sort of analytical thinking as my greatest talent or skill. Now, one other thing that's important is to think about highlighting small or unconventional ways in which you might use a talent or a skill. So say, for example, that you want to talk about your ability to debate. Obviously, you can talk about winning debate competitions and being the president of your debate club and so on, but what can make for a really cool essay is when you kind of flip the script a little bit. So for example, let's say that you said something about how your ability to debate helped you win an argument with your younger brother who was going to make a really bad decision to, lie to your parents and sneak out of your house to hang out with someone else. And he would have broken your parents' trust and so on, but you were able to debate with him and, get him to make good decisions. Talking about those small ways in which your skill or your talent intersects with the rest of your life can make for a really cool contrast and a really interesting essay. And it's really important to use stories here. That's the broader point, right? You don't want to just talk about your talent or skill. Give a couple of stories or examples where it came into play. Now, obviously, with a 350-word essay, you can't, tell each story in full. Feel free to use one story. No more than 2 to 3 is my recommendation, because otherwise you won't give each story enough justice. It won't be explained enough. But you can even do a longer sort of single narrative throughout as well. Problem number 4 is taking advantage of an educational opportunity. Now, obviously, there's a line in here about educational barriers, but as you'll see in problem number 5, I tend to think that if you have an educational challenge, problem number 5 tends to be a better place to write about that. So I really like to focus on the opportunity side of this essay, right? One thing to keep in mind here is that the word educational opportunity does not mean it is inside the classroom. In fact, educational work that's either sort of outside of traditional academic work or stuff that you did beyond the classroom to enhance your learning can be a really good fit for this essay. And it doesn't necessarily have to be an academic opportunity. So for example, in this for this essay back in high school, I might have written about how I started to really understand basketball analytics and talk about my experiences teaching myself basketball analytics and using that to become a sports writer for a San Antonio Spurs team website, basically. Right? That's what I would have written for my essay, but it can really be anything. It doesn't have to be inside of the classroom. It just has to be something where you took a step beyond. Now, on the other hand, if you're in a situation where you were maybe not challenging yourself before in your academic classes and you took a step to push past and kind of challenge yourself more, you can talk about stuff inside the classroom. Just don't feel like you have to do that, right? Another thing you can talk about is personality traits or health conditions that affected your academic experience, both positively or negatively. A good rule of thumb for both prompt number 4 and prompt number 5 is think about what you might write about on the additional info section of the Common App. There's not quite a great analogous section on the UC application, so you can write about it in some of these prompts. Prompt number 5 is describe the most significant challenge you have faced and the steps you have taken to overcome this challenge. So this is the challenge prompt. And then it specifically asks about how the challenge has affected your academic achievement. So you got to be careful not to write about something that hasn't affected your academic achievement, or be thoughtful about that. It doesn't mean you can't do it, but you just got to be careful because it is asked in the prompt, and sometimes different readers will be more or less of a stickler about that. The single biggest thing you have to do with this essay is make sure that your challenge doesn't come out as tone deaf, right? If the people marching through the streets across May, June, and July, and potentially more if more tragedies happen down the line, if those folks hadn't made it clear, 2020 is yet another year in which folks are being challenged to come to terms with privilege. We're all being challenged to come to the terms with the privileges that we have, and to think about kind of the inequities in society around us. And that crosses over into the admissions process, especially because a lot of college admissions officers are very progressive, in that you want to be very careful not to come off as privileged. Obviously, you have day-to-day privilege from things like your ethnicity, your gender background, your socioeconomic status, and stuff like that. But there's also a lot of what I would describe as COVID privilege. There's a very, very disparate experience with COVID-19 in this country. Some folks have more or less gotten through it scot-free. On the other hand, there's been disruptions, obviously, but for the most part, your families are healthy, happy, safe, and not necessarily worse off in terms of your economic or living situation. Those of you who are in that situation are very lucky. There's other folks who have lost a family member to COVID-19, or who have a parent or a loved one working an essential role where they're exposed to risk, right? And this is personal for me, right? My mom goes to work every day in hospitals and nursing homes where there are COVID patients, right? And I'm at least lucky in that my mom, and so far most of my family around the world, has been healthy and come out of COVID-19, knock on wood here, safe. But there are plenty of folks who are have had even worse outcomes, whether it's, losing a job, losing a family member, etc. And so you really want to make sure that the challenge you write about doesn't come out as tone deaf, right? Missing out on opportunities due to COVID, your extracurricular opportunities or whatever, obviously that's very important to you. I'm not here to try and say that you shouldn't be disappointed or it's unfair for you to be disappointed or whatever. It's just not going to come off well in a college essay. And just to hit home the point one more time, don't write about COVID, right? Not only because of the potential risk of sounding tone deaf, but also because every single person in the entire country has gone through COVID. And unfortunately, a lot of you are going to write about it. Pretty much everyone who's not watching this video is probably thinking about writing about COVID. And so when a bunch of people write about the same essay topic, it becomes a lot harder for your essay to stand out. And standing out and seeming unique to colleges is the single most important thing you'll be doing in the admissions process. A couple other things to keep in mind with this prompt. First, you want to avoid telling a sob story. You can't just describe the challenge and its negative impacts. You have to talk about how you moved past it. And another thing is, because there's that academic component, you want to be careful not to blame your teachers. If your teachers were your source of your struggle, make sure you present that as a two-sided relationship. I didn't do a good job communicating with my teacher, and they were not able to communicate back to me, right? Make sure it's a two-sided situation, and make sure that you're being very cautious about that, because colleges don't like to see you putting down your teachers. Problem number 6 is talking about an academic subject that inspires you. And really the only thing I have to say here, or the biggest thing I have to say about this prompt, is I want to see you go deeper. And then go even deeper than that, right? And what I mean by that is pretty much everyone who's going to write this essay is going to talk about how much they love biology, or chemistry, or economics, or physics. And congratulations, 28,000 other applicants are going to write the same thing. But if you go one level deeper, go to econometrics instead of economics, marine biology instead of biology, or even one layer deeper than that, go into monetary policy or manatee habitats, or I can't think of the third word in the M alliteration, but you get my point. Go deeper into the subject. A, it shows that you really love the subject and that you're knowledgeable about it. B, it helps burnish your credentials for the major that you're applying to in a subtle way, right? And C, it helps your essay stand out. go as deep as possible into a particular subject as long as you have the accomplishments and the experience, basically the knowledge and the experience to justify why you're going so deep, right? And again, obviously with prompt number 6, let's go back to my favorite refrain: don't restate your resume. Discuss concrete accomplishments if you want, but only do it if it's going to illustrate a personal trait that you want to show off. And it's really important here to understand that this prompt is asking not just what is this subject, but why do you love the subject? Why does it inspire you? I don't just want to hear I love biology. I want to hear I love biology because X, Y, and Z. Prompt number 7 is the community prompt, and there's a few different things you can think about here. First of all, it doesn't have to be a large or even a formal community. It can obviously be a club or a class or your school, but it can also be, a friend group, your ethnic community, whether international or local. It can even be a virtual community, like a forum or a subreddit that you're an active participant in, right? Now, one thing that's really important with this essay is I see a lot of people make the mistake of spending too much time talking about the community and describing the community and not spending enough time talking about your personal connection to the community. How do you relate to that community, and how does it relate to you? How does it drive who you are as a person? Why did you do the things that you did to make that community a better place? You need to illustrate that and your values and how you upheld them through your actions. And it's important to mention the positive impact, but don't spend too much time on it. A lot of times what I'll see with this essay is you explain the community, you talk about what you did, and you talk about how it made the community a better place, but you didn't talk about why. This essay is much more about understanding your values and your motivations than it is about understanding a positive impact in some community that the admissions officer, let's be frank here, probably doesn't care about, right? What they care about is how do you relate to your community, and how has your community made you the person that you are today, and why did that inspire you to try and make your community a better place? The last prompt we're going to talk about today is prompt number 8, which is the open-ended prompt. The potpourri prompt, is the open-ended prompt, or as I like to call it, the poo-poo platter, right? Basically, it's an open-ended question. It's kind of let's call it a dumping ground for, a really great essay that you've written somewhere else that doesn't quite fit into one of the first 7 prompts, right? It's an open-ended question. It's an opportunity to be creative, but it carries more risk. What I will say here is that this is a place where you can write about something that doesn't really fit with one of the first 7 prompts. I don't like using this as experimental in the same way that you might use the Common App 6th prompt as experimental. And the reason is that, with the UC schools, you don't have that Common App to help out. And there are 4 essays. And so because there are 4 essays, chances are most of what you'd want to convey needs to be conveyed across those different essays that you write. So if you lose one of them because you took a risk, right, you lose 25% of your payoff, or of your essay power, for lack of a better word. So I tend to prefer writing a conventional style essay for this prompt, but if you want to take risks, if you're a gambler, if you're interested in swinging for the fences, go for it. I mean, this is the place to do it. Because it's the other thing I would say is that when you try to do something that's super creative, 350 words as a prompt limit can be a little bit more of a constraint. So just keep that in mind, but this is your opportunity to go wild. This is also your opportunity to reuse an essay that doesn't quite fit into one of the first 7 prompts. So which of those 2 extremes you end up on, that's going to really be up to you. All right, folks, that's going to go ahead and wrap up our YouTube video. As always, thank you for watching and sticking around with me. I think this is going to end up being something like 30 minutes by the time it's edited. Shout out to the great team at CollegeVine for editing this video. And other than that, that's all I got. I will catch you all later.